Similar to what Kavita had mentioned yesterday, we've been talking about a lot of big topics here and issues today again. This is a little bit more procedural in nature, talking a little bit more about GCF, how to work with us, particularly on our project-specific accreditation approach. So I'm going to introduce that to you today. My name is Tim Breitbarth. I'm the Investment Operations Manager at GCF. Now, I know Kavita had mentioned yesterday a little bit more about the PSAA. She had talked about it as a new modality for GCF. So I'm going to give you a little more detail on how it works today. I'm going to tell you about what is PSAA. I'm going to explain a little bit more about how PSAA works. I'm going to go over some criteria you can use to determine whether PSAA is the right partnership for your organization with GCF. And then hopefully at the end we'll have some time for a few questions. Okay, so let's start at the top with what is PSAA. And maybe before we do that, we should take a step back and talk a little bit about GCF's business model. So, as many of you know, GCF relies on accredited entities to implement our projects and programs. This is done in coordination with our national designated authorities, which are the focal points within the governments of the countries that we work in. And this is to ensure alignment with national priorities and country ownership throughout the process. But the accreditation process works by the entity submits a lot of information to GCF about their capacity to implement projects and uphold GCF accreditation standards. And then GCF assesses the entity's capacity to do that and decides whether or not to accredit. This takes some time to accomplish, but after accreditation then, an entity may submit a pipeline of funding proposals to GCF. There's no limit on the number of funding proposals that an accredited entity may submit, but only accredited entities may submit funding proposals. Just to explain a little bit more about what accreditation actually is, there are several facets to accreditation. There's first of all mandate and track record, taking a look at the alignment with GCF objectives. We also take a look at the project or program size. So different entities may be accredited for different sizes of projects, some micro, some medium, some all the way up to large. Entities may also be accredited for different financing modalities. Could be just the basic financing modality, but there are several specialized fiduciary standards that go with certain types of accreditation for project management, grant award, on-lending or blending. And then we also tailor the accreditation to specific environmental and social risk categories. So projects with, some entities may only be able to implement projects with low environmental or social risks. Others may be able to do all the way up to high risk projects, which we would consider category A projects. So that's a little bit more about what accreditation actually is. We have different types of accredited entities, including public, private, non-governmental organizations. We also categorize them into direct access and international access. The direct access entities are those that are subnational, national, or regional entities based in developing countries. And the international access entities are ones that work worldwide. These are your UN agencies, multilateral development banks, international financial institutions, large private sector organizations would all fall into the international access category. Okay, so that's accreditation. Now, what is project-specific accreditation, which we refer to as PSAA, which is the project-specific assessment approach to GCF accreditation. PSAA is a new approach for entities to access GCF financing for a single project or program. And our goal for this is to reach new countries, partners, and technologies that may have been underserved by the traditional accredited entity network. The PSAA is a 3-year pilot that was launched in April of this year, so we haven't approved any projects under the PSAA yet, but we are accepting applications. And one of the unique features of the PSAA is that the review of capacity, the accreditation review, if you will, occurs in parallel to the review of the project. And this hopefully shortens the time frame overall. Now, the PSA consists of an assessment of the entity's capacity to meet GCF accreditation standards in the context of the specific project. So I think Kavita mentioned yesterday that we're maybe not looking as much at the overall institutional policies and procedures, but whether or not the entity can uphold GCF standards within a single project. Now, that project should be aligned with, obviously, the national priorities and country programs of the countries that it's being implemented in, but also the GCF strategic plan, the GCF sectoral guides, which explain how we intend to achieve impact in various sectors, the GCF private sector strategy for any private sector entities out there. These documents are all available on our website, and I encourage you to please take a look at them, read through them in detail to see how your organization and your project might fit within them, because that really makes for a stronger pitch to GCF. Now, there are some benefits to the PSAA. PSAA can fund any project size, any financial instrument that's offered by the fund, grants, loans, guarantees, equity. It can use any GCF approval process. Some of you may be familiar with the simplified approval process. That's eligible for PSAA, along with any GCF request for proposals that we issue from time to time. There's also just a single legal agreement for accreditation and the project financing. There's not multiple agreements to be signed. However, there are some limitations with PSAA. First of all, one funding proposal maximum. So after a single funding proposal is approved and financed under PSAA, if the entity wants to do another project with GCF, we need to go through institutional accreditation in order to do that. The entity must have the capacity to implement the project, but also the capacity to uphold GCF accreditation standards, and an independent legal personality to enter into contractual arrangements with GCF. As I mentioned before, we have different types of environmental and social risk categories for our projects. Under the PSA, only those projects with low to medium environmental and social risks are eligible for PSA. And if you don't know where your project falls under that framework, please talk to one of us, talk to someone from GCF who can help you understand where your project fits in the GCF landscape a little better. Kavita mentioned this yesterday. We have sector specialists, climate investment specialists who can help you with your applications and explain to you how GCF works and how your project would fit within the GCF pipeline. PSA entities are also required to report on accreditation standards throughout the project, along with the project KPIs on an annual basis. Now, there are some operational responsibilities and administrative responsibilities for PSA entities as well. The operational responsibilities are very similar to what you would find for just project implementation, right? Need to engage with GCF, the National Designated Authority, throughout the project cycle. Need to be able to design, implement, and deliver the project or program, and then monitor and report on those results. On the administrative side, these are more related to the accreditation standards for PSA. You need to provide evidence of institutional systems, policies, track record, especially track record, to ensure that you can meet GCF standards, ensure downstream executing entities uphold GCF accreditation standards and policies, need to be able to, as I said, monitor, report, and verify those throughout the implementation of the project, and enter into legal agreements with GCF. Okay, so I've talked a lot about the accreditation standards. What are the accreditation standards for PSAA? And we kind of break them down into 4 different categories. So the first one is basic fiduciary standards. These should be pretty familiar to most of you. It's just making sure that you have the administrative and financial capacities to handle GCF resources. Along with that, we have the specialized fiduciary standards, and these are for the specialized accreditation modalities that I mentioned, project management, grant award, on-lending or blending. They have special fiduciary standards that we would need to look at in this context as well. We also look at gender policies, procedures, and competencies to ensure that you can, your organization will be able to uphold the GCF gender policy throughout the project cycle, and environmental and social safeguards to make sure that there's an appropriate system in place to manage the environmental or social risk involved with each project in accordance with the risk levels that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so that's the PSAA accreditation itself. So how does the process work? So as Kavita mentioned yesterday, normally we have this accreditation process. It takes some time, but once an entity is accredited, you can submit funding proposals to GCF. What the project-specific assessment approach does is it enables an entity to submit an application for accreditation and a project proposal at the same time. And so we review the entity's capacity to implement the project and the project itself in parallel, saving time that way. Now, it doesn't necessarily cut down the time on the GCF review of the project, but it does eliminate that extra step for accreditation prior to the funding proposal review. Okay, these are the steps in the PSAA application process. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. You can find detail about each of these steps on our website. So I encourage you to go look at the website for any more information on that. But there are 3 points in the process here that I want to identify for you. The first one is the initial step, and this is how you formally initiate the PSAA process. And it consists of just submitting a simple questionnaire on our website. It takes about 20 minutes to complete, along with a project pitch book that describes your project, just a few slides kind of outlining for us what the project is, how you intend to work with GCF, and then a summary of stakeholder engagement and how the project aligns with country priorities. So that's the initial screen, and we will give you some initial feedback on that. And then we'll invite you to submit a concept note. And the concept note could be 20 to 30 pages or so, and this kind of fleshes out the climate rationale for the project, the proposed theory of change of the project, and how this project will work and achieve impact. And then if that's cleared by our climate investment committee, then we'll invite you to submit a full funding proposal and a complete PSAA application. This also includes all the project proposal annexes that are required, including feasibility studies, budget, economic analysis, any environmental and social safeguards documents, along with a no objection letter from the country or countries that the project will be implemented in. Now you'll notice that the degree of detail and the amount of information increases as you move through the process. Now that's by design, right? We don't want you to waste time on a project idea that is not suitable for PSAA. We also don't want to spend time reviewing ideas that are not suitable for PSAA. So we want to be able to provide early feedback when you haven't invested a lot of time and resources yet to either help you assess whether a project idea is appropriate for PSAA, maybe how it can be adapted to make it more suitable for PSAA, before we get too far into this process when you're having to undertake feasibility studies and design budgets and things like that. Okay, I'm sure you're asking, how long does this all take? So this is an indicative timeline for each step. You don't have to try to add this all up. I'll just tell you it's around 8 to 9 months or so. And this is, at the moment, the kind of the best case scenario for this. Now, I should also note that the project review process and the PSAA review process is iterative, right? So if we ask for a revision of a document or some additional information on something, that will add some time to the process. Each iteration probably adds another 2 to 4 weeks or so. Now, as I mentioned before, this was just started in April of this year, so it's a new process. We are learning from it, and hopefully we intend to find some efficiencies in this process and reduce that timeline a bit for you. But we just wanted to set the expectations appropriately at the beginning here, so that you know kind of what you'd be getting into. In terms of the scale of this, GCF is currently planning to undertake around 10 PSA application reviews per year during the pilot period. We accept applications from any entity, but we are currently prioritizing those applications from subnational, national, regional entities based in developing countries, particularly those that have yet to access GCF funding and any entities responding to GCF requests for proposals. Okay, so that's what is PSA, that's how it works. Now you might be asking, okay, is PSA the right partnership for my organization with GCF? And I should note that there are many ways to partner with GCF, right? So you could be an accredited entity, you could be a PSAA entity, you could be an executing entity implementing a project underneath an accredited entity or parts of a project under an accredited entity. It could be a co-financier to a project or a parallel financier providing funding for a complementary activity that's outside the funding structure, but still nevertheless generates complementary results to the project. It could also be a readiness delivery partner, which my colleague will talk about later, the readiness program. And then, of course, you could be a downstream beneficiary of some of the GCF financing from one of our approved projects or funds as well. We've had a few examples of that described so far. So that's something that you may be familiar with as well. But all that to say is accreditation might not be the best fit for your organization. PSAA may not be the best fit for your organization. So what you need to do is think about what are the objectives of your project and your partnership with GCF, and is accreditation or PSA the best fit for that? GCF, as I mentioned, will provide initial feedback and assessments on the project's suitability for PSA, but this is something that also we encourage partners to consider at an early stage as well. So if you've decided that PSA might be the right partnership, there are some questions you can ask to determine whether it really would be suitable for PSA. First, does your entity seek GCF financing for one project or many projects, right? One project might be a good PSAA project. If you have a whole pipeline of projects you want to bring to GCF, maybe going the traditional accreditation route would be better, because then it enables you to submit that entire pipeline once you're accredited. Also, secondly, is there a single well-formed project idea aligned with GCF strategic objectives? PSAA is project-specific accreditation, so our assumption is that there is a project, that you have a project in mind already. If you don't have a project in mind, we're not working on PSAA applications in the absence of a project. So once you've developed that project idea, then please come to us after that. Is the proposal aligned with country priorities, and is there country support for the project idea? You know, country ownership is a core principle of GCF, and therefore we want to make sure that the project is aligned with those country priorities, but also to help you and your organization implement the project later on. It's much easier to implement the project if you have people on board from the beginning and they're invested in it as well, rather than trying to do that later in the process. And then the last thing is, does your entity have a track record of implementing similar projects and showing the capacity to uphold GCF accreditation standards? And this is what we're referring to when we said project-specific accreditation and not institutional accreditation. We're not necessarily looking for all the right policies and procedures, but have you shown in the past that you can do projects of this size and scope in a manner that's consistent with GCF criteria? And that's really what we rely on. Track record is a very important part of PSAA. Okay, so if you've gone through all those questions and you think PSAA may be the right approach to work with GCF, I encourage you to, first of all, as was mentioned yesterday, talk to someone from GCF, talk about your project, and indicate that you're interested in PSAA. We can help connect you with the right people. Also, go to our website, submit the PSAA questionnaire, pitch book, and summary of stakeholder engagements and country ownership. And then we'll take an initial review of those materials and, like I said, and either invite you to submit a concept note or we'll ask for some additional information. Or if we think that it's maybe not the right fit for PSAA, we will issue regrets at that point. Okay, so that's kind of PSAA in just a few brief minutes. PSAA is a new approach for entities to access GCF financing for a single project or program. We hope that it enables us to work with new countries, partners, and technologies that haven't accessed GCF financing before. GCF conducts the project and capacity reviews in parallel during the PSAA process. Any interested entities should carefully assess whether PSAA is the right partnership for your organization before applying. And then the way to apply once you have determined it's the right fit is to begin with questionnaire submission on our website. And just a quick plug for the website. If you have additional questions, there's a wealth of information on our website about PSAA, detailed descriptions of every step of the process, the eligibility criteria. You can find the questionnaire there. You can find templates for the various documents there. And if you go through all that and you still have questions, please feel free to email us. We have a dedicated email account for this, psaa@gcfund.org. We're happy to take any questions, and if the team who's receiving these can't answer the question, we can pass it along to someone who will. So that's something that please feel free to take advantage of that because we do want to support you in this process. So with that, I'll pause, thank you, and take any questions that you may have. See a number of questions here. I think the gentleman over here, I think I saw first.
Okay, thank you very much. I asked a question about GCF before. My name is Mark Ambito. I'm a lead consultant with a research firm. My question basically goes into the experience. Because like somebody like me, I travel a lot to Asia, most likely Bangladesh and India. And I've seen a lot of projects that there are quite impactful. I think somebody talked there sometimes before about Ask Power Systems that has been given something like about $500 million. And so I'm asking, if I might not be having the experience, but then I need like something like franchising from a company in Bangladesh, India, or Pakistan to set up a project here that has been successful in India, has scaled up in India. So are we eligible? Thank you.
It's a good question. I think we need to think about eligibility a little different from whether it's suitable for the PSAA. So definitely eligibility, not an issue as long as you meet the basic criteria of having independent legal personality and capacity to implement the project. But where the track record comes in is understanding whether there is capacity to implement that project. And so there might be a model that has been implemented successfully in another country by another organization. But we need to understand whether your organization has done something similar and has shown the capacity to undertake similar types of projects. We do know that as part of PSAA, there will be entities that are applying that have would like to use PSA as a way to generate a bit of a track record for institutional accreditation. But we still need some kind of basic track record to ensure that even this one project, that there's some track record of implementing something similar or upholding GCF standards in a similar way. So I think it's back there.
Hello, Humphrey Reckle from Cross Boundary. First off, thank you for the presentation. I think the PSAA is a nice innovation in the GCF process. If you're an organization like us who might have been up until this point considering the accreditation process, and then here actually this is my first time hearing about the PSAA at this conference. If you have a project that's ready to go that you might want to try through PSAA and you still want to also do accreditation, can you do both at the same time?
Yeah, so you can do both, but I guess it depends on where you are in the accreditation process, right? If you were just thinking about it and you think, you know what, we really have this project that's ready to go now and we want to move on it, then maybe PSA is the best way to start that. And as I said, it kind of generates that track record for institutional accreditation that might help you out later on. If you're already in the institutional accreditation process, it is a very resource and labor intensive process, I understand. And so you'll need to ask, depending on where you are in the process, is it worth kind of shifting to PSA or going ahead with the institutional accreditation application as is? If you're far along in the process, you might just want to stick with the institutional accreditation. But if it's still very early stages, maybe PSA is the better route. These are intended to be complementary, not competitive with one another. But there are different needs for different organizations depending on the maturity of your project idea and how far along in the accreditation process you are. So
quick question. That's a two-part question. So if the project, say, is an investment vehicle that can invest across multiple countries, right, regional strategy, A, does that investment vehicle count as a project? And B, how do you go about sort of defining which is the dominant country, if you will, for the country of support, or do you need one for that?
Good question. So, okay, so when I say projects, I'm using that as a shorthand for projects or programs. So what you're describing sounds like it might be a program. Perfectly okay with GCF. We fund plenty of programs as well. We have many multi-country programs. In regards to the country ownership and specifically the no objection letters. So GCF needs a no objection letter to implement a project in a country. Right? We can't just go in and implement a project in a country without that letter of no objection from the country's authorities. So we can work with you a little bit on how to obtain those letters, but it's also something that we expect early engagement from your side as well, so that it's not on us, right? It's on the accredited entity or the PSA entity to get those as well. But yes, for multi-country programs, every country that is included in that project will need a no objection letter. Okay, I think there's someone over here. So.
Not sure if you can hear me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. I think you started your presentation by saying that you've designed this process to hopefully crowd in some untypical actors in the universe of GCF. So I'd like to ask a bit more, an idea of what would be your sweet spot of kind of institutions, what sizes. Of course, you have very broad range of accredited entities, but let's say they're all large enough to be able to meet your standards. do you expect to source maybe smaller or more local African-owned, African-based organizations through this process, and therefore is the assessment of the ability of the implementing institution to uphold to your standards really different to the accreditation process, or are you going to crowd in the same type of organization in the end?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's fair to ask that. So I think the best way to understand the types of organizations we're looking at would be to look through our strategic plan for the next 4 years and see what are we actually targeting and what types of projects do we want to bring in. For instance, we have a target to double the number of direct access entities with approved funding proposals over the next 4 years. That's going to take a concerted effort from GCF. The PSAA is a key part of that. Similarly, some of the sector transitions that we have targets for, we are going to be looking for PSAA to meet some of those as well. So it's kind of directed towards some of our programmatic objectives rather than just the type of organizations we want to work with. If they help us achieve those objectives, that's who we want to work with. As far as your second question about the standards and whether they're different or not, I think that's a little hard to assess right now because we haven't received a lot of proposals just yet. They're still coming in. But the accreditation standards are still the accreditation standards, right? So that part is not changing a whole lot. The difference is whether we're looking at it from an institutional perspective, whether all the proper controls and policies are in place in order to uphold these standards, or on the PSAA side, whether there is a track record of it in similar projects in the past, right? And in which case, we're not going to focus as much on all the institutional aspects because an entity has shown that they've been able to do that in a similar project in the past.
Can I go ahead?
So, yes.
My questions are similar to what she has asked. I just wanted to confirm if you already come up with a system to understand whether you have a soft spot to partnership that brings in the government or purely private, and if you already have subdivided the budget for project accreditation across sectors, and which sectors are you going to look into, and if for the pilot phase you already have say a capped number of partners that you're going to work with.
Thanks for the question. So we don't have specific sector allocations for PSAA. As I mentioned, we're looking at it in the context of GCF strategic objectives and our targets for the next 4 years. So we don't have, we haven't set aside any specific amounts within PSAA for any specific sector. It's a little bit more flexible than that. As I mentioned, we are targeting 10 funding proposal reviews per year. That's sort of what the guidance that our board gave us on that. But that's mostly based on practical considerations in terms of what we think we can actually achieve given the other priorities that we have and the other funding proposals that we're going to be working with as well. So in that sense, we probably have over a 3-year period, if it's 10 per year, we probably up to about 30, but that's not a hard cap either. Right? It kind of depends on how many projects do we have that are suitable, and if there's a 31st project or 32nd project that is really good and suitable for PSA, we're not going to hold back on that because we want to achieve those impacts. I see one back there.
So is that review, you mentioned the 10 number, is that on an ongoing basis, or sort of, we're in, let's call it September now, you've already have all the 10 that you need for the year, so anything else that comes in goes into the beginning of the year, or just how does that actually work,
Yeah.
practically?
So that's actually just a general guideline. It's again not, there's no limitation on it necessarily. It's not a hard cap. It's just sort of an indicative amount that we intend to do each year. So if we have enough in a single year, more than our 10, we might do more. I should also say that when we say 10 application reviews per year, this is reviews of the full application. We will probably receive plenty more questionnaires and concept notes than that. We're happy to take those. We're not going to limit ourselves necessarily on that. But in terms of the resources that go into doing these reviews of the full PSAA application, that's where we're targeting around 10 per year. But it depends on how many we receive and how many good project ideas we have. Yes, in front of you. And sorry if I'm missing anyone. The lights are kind of bright. I'm trying to get to as many as I can.
Thank you so much. I will have a very short question. My question is, I'm from Ethiopia and have worked with local farmers. I really see the impact of direct access getting financed directly to local communities. And I was wondering that whether you could support farmers who are organized in a traditional way. They have traditional financial institutions, but maybe not in a formal way. So I was wondering if these are some of the accepted criteria in your application process, because I know that smallholder farmers are really active players in adaptation and mitigation actions. They successfully implement these strategies, but right now it's mainly dominated by national level actors and regional actors who may not be responding to climate change impacts at the local level.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Good question. This is, so if you look into our strategic plan for the next 4 years, one of the things that we intend to do is more locally led adaptation with devolved financing approaches. Now that won't necessarily be GCF working with individual farmers or financial institutions, but we might set up structures to enable us to work with a whole range of local financial institutions to kind of reduce the transaction costs a bit. And make sure that there's still kind of decision making at the local level, helping them in the ways that you're referring to in some of those local institutions in a way that makes sense and keeps their transaction costs low, because working with GCF can be like I said, resource intensive sometimes. So thank you. I see that I'm at the end of the time here. Thank you so much for your attention today and your interest in the PSAA. Will be available for questions throughout the evening as well if you have any other questions. So thank you so much.